My name's Dr. Sharon Jagger. I'm a lecturer in religion at York St John University, and this seminar is brought to you by our Centre for Religion in Society. Just to point out, folks, that we have regular seminars such as this one. They're not all online, so do go to our blog site if you search Centre for Religion in Society, York St John University. All our events, they're all free, they're open to anybody who's interested, and you'll find the programme on there. So thank you very much for joining us for this particular seminar. I want to formally now introduce Dr. Alex Fry. Alex is a lecturer in sociology. He's at Bournemouth University, and I'll just flag up some work that Alex and I are starting together, which is really exciting stuff. We're looking at working class clergy and their experience in the priesthood in the Church of England. So look out for blogs and writings and tweets and things that we'll send out about that. We're really looking forward to getting stuck into that project. But in the meantime, Alex and I share a research interest in gender and the priesthood. And I was delighted to come across Alex's work fairly recently, because I've been researching one side of this subject. I've interviewed lots of women priests, but brilliantly, Alex has managed to interview male clergy who are opposed to women being ordained. And that is still a live issue if you're not very familiar with it. So Alex has the other side of the story, if you like. So this evening, we're going to find out the detail of why some male clergy believe what they believe about women clergy, and what Alex has made of some of those conversations that he's had. So thanks again, Alex, for being here. It's brilliant that you can share some of this research with us. So I just want to kick off. Can you tell us a little bit about your research as a whole and the cohort that you managed to interview, and also why are you interested in this subject?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons I think that I became interested in the subject in the first place was probably during my master's studies. So I did an MA in theology and religious studies when I was in London. And one of the kind of core elements of the course was a double module on hermeneutics. And one of the things that struck me was how people from very different backgrounds, different social contexts, would approach the same texts in the Bible, often with similar hermeneutical strategies, similar ways of trying to understand the text, but come to sometimes radically very different conclusions. And it got me thinking, well, theology isn't simply about theology, is it? There's something about social context, there's something about what the individual brings with them to a biblical text. And so that really led me more into the social sciences. And I mean, this was a question that interested me anyway. I knew people who had very strong views on both sides of the ordination of women debates. And so, yeah, that's really what got me interested. And that's really what led me to a more social scientific investigation. So my PhD, I started it in 2016. I did my fieldwork in 2017. And I spent about a year, I would say, interviewing clergy, male clergy, as you said, from different wings of the Church of England. Now, the Church of England being as broad as it is and as diverse as it is, and the PhD, although it's a long kind of chunk of thesis, you have to narrow down to quite some extent. And so I decided to go for the more theologically conservative traditions in the Church of England, because they're where you're most likely to pick up clergy who oppose women's ordination. And so that meant the traditional Anglo-Catholics, it meant conservative evangelicals, and it also meant charismatic evangelicals, although that was a more interesting group in some respects, because although they're theologically conservative, they are often more open to women's ordination and to women's ministry in a variety of different contexts. So it wasn't quite that they acted as a control group, but they were a helpful contrast to have, particularly because most, although not all, of my charismatic evangelical participants were more affirming of women's ordination and had less traditionalist views. And they all came from one diocese as well in the Church of England. I haven't disclosed the diocese for reasons of research ethics and anonymity and those sorts of reasons, but I chose a diocese that was essentially a microcosm of the Church of England. It reflected the whole variety of church traditions in the diocese. It had a mixture of urban, suburban and kind of rural areas as well. And like the wider church, it is perceived to have had a kind of series of theologically liberal leaders as well. So it was a really good this was a qualitative study, mostly with interviews, but it was a really good kind of test case for the theories I ended up exploring, because it was really, a microcosm of the wider Church of England.
Really fascinating that you managed to capture, that breadth of positionings, even when we possibly think it's a minority voice anyway. Did you get to the hub of the theology and the doctrines that male clergy sort of use to scaffold, I suppose, their opposition to women's clergy? The reason I'm hesitating is not everything boils down to theology, I don't think, does it? What were your findings?
Sure, definitely it doesn't all boil down to theology. I'll say as a kind of caveat to what I'm about to say, is that theology and theological sources, like in biblical texts and tradition and so on, definitely do come to shape people's views on women in church leadership. I'm not suggesting theology is irrelevant, but theology, I found, and I'll talk a bit about this in more detail later, but theology is significantly shaped by social factors, both contemporary social influences, including psychological ones, but also historical influences as well. But to answer the question more directly, we spent a long time talking about theology and clarifying the nuts and bolts of different theological positions that my participants expressed. But one of the key findings really was opposition to women's ordination is the theology behind it is very diverse. The traditions, the different traditions that I explored approach this question in very different ways, which is why it's quite interesting that often these groups would form a united front in opposition at, the General Synod, for example, the church's governing body. But it also helps explain why these different traditions have different opposition groups. So there's an Anglo-Catholic opposition group, there's an evangelical opposition group. But the kind of thinking, when I was at school, you often in maths exams had show your working. Well, if you were to ask my participants to show their working, Anglo-Catholics and evangelicals, very different working, very different rationales for their theological objection to women's ordination. And even within that, it wasn't always an objection to ordination per se. Sometimes it was an opposition to certain tasks that generally ordained people do, or it was ordination to the priesthood, but not to the diaconate, not as deacons. So to start with the Anglo-Catholics, one of the big objections was the need for unity with the Roman Catholic Church, and also to a lesser extent the Eastern Orthodox Church. The idea being, well, if those two churches, of which we are, as the Church of England, united with historically, don't ordain women, then neither should we, because otherwise there forms a rift. The whole idea of the Church of England and Anglo-Catholic thought really was that the Reformation was a last resort. There is a desire for unity with the Roman Catholic Church ultimately, and so anything that is perceived to impair that unity including the ordination of women, is considered to be basically undesirable and worthy of opposition. And within that, you get a lot of adoption of Catholic theology, as you might expect. So this idea of apostolic succession is really important for the Anglo-Catholics. The idea that Jesus supposedly appointed only male apostles, and that therefore the apostolic line, which of course is it's where the priesthood and the episcopacy, the role of the bishops, come into this, should only be male, as has been church tradition, supposedly from the get-go, from the birth of the Christian faith through to, in the Church of England's case, the 1990s. And they do, in distinction to their evangelical counterparts, they do claim to adhere to a contextualized reading of biblical passages around gender. So 1 Timothy 2 is one of those famous texts where Paul or whoever wrote the pastoral letters, writes, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Or they would say, well, that's not really about priesthood. That's more of a contextual thing. But interestingly, that kind of adherence to contextual readings of the Bible is somewhat selective, which isn't surprising because we find religious folk from, across different faith traditions inevitably end up being a bit selective in their reading of texts anyway. But what you find, for example, is a kind of sidelining or ignoring or explaining away of kind of contextualizations of parts of the Bible that indicate that there were female apostles. For example, Priscilla is widely understood to be a female apostle. And there's the deacon, Phoebe, in the letter to the Romans is mentioned, and women were the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection in at least some of the Gospels, which also indicates apostolic status. And so what you have then with the Anglo-Catholics really is this incorporation of Roman Catholic theology and ecclesiology, our relationship, or the Church of England's relationship to Rome, as central, and an articulated willingness to contextualize scripture, so not to take those verses about gender out of context. But they only do that selectively. They don't seem to engage with some of the kind of, I suppose, more subtle or finer indications in the New Testament that seem to, at least according to a lot of New Testament commentators, strongly indicate the presence of female apostles, which would obviously undermine the appeal to tradition and the fact that Jesus supposedly only elected male apostles.
That's really fascinating, actually, because you are unpacking there in a little bit more detail the types of theologies and the doctrinal stances that male clergy will reach for and say, this is why I don't believe that women should or could be ordained. And we can always unpack those in more detail if people want to explore that. Just to mirror some of my research, what are the lived experiences of men who are openly saying that women, their colleagues, can't be priests? When they come across women and they're working alongside women, what's their experience of that? Do they have a kind of emotional reaction to it?
That's a really interesting question. And one of the things that was very obvious across the Anglo-Catholics and the conservative evangelicals, and I'll unpack the conservative evangelical approach in a bit. But one of the interesting things across those traditions was a kind of softening of the language they would use. And this has been noted in the USA as well, a kind of softening of evangelical language. But I found this in the UK context, and I found it amongst Anglo-Catholics, which had not previously been picked up on in research, but or at least not to the best of my knowledge. So, for example, Anglo-Catholics would often use the language of doubt. So the ability of women to consecrate the bread and the wine, or rather for Christ to consecrate, or the Holy Spirit to consecrate the bread and the wine through the priest, that communion is brought into doubt, as are other kind of sacramental duties of a priest, because of a perceived break in that apostolic line with the ordination of women as priests. And that's one reason why Anglo-Catholics don't mind necessarily women being ordained as deacons, because deacons don't fulfill all of the sacramental roles that a priest does, especially around the altar. So rather than saying it's definitely wrong, it's very much, we suspect there's an issue here, which seems to be a response to their awareness, and they are very much aware that their views are not very widely received in the church. A number of participants, I'm thinking of one Anglo-Catholic in particular here, mentioned feeling very frustrated of being marginalized. So he reported a neighboring parish priest publicly stating quite negative things about him because of his views. And actually, some of these conversations threw up a lot of complexity when it came to the different identities that we all carry as human beings. So this particular participant was from a working class background, is also a gay man, and is celibate because of his theological convictions, and is frustrated that the church still officially has a more traditional stance on homosexuality, but not on gender, and feels that there's something quite unfair in that he's being marginalized on two accounts: his traditional gender views, but also his sexuality, and sees that there's a partiality there in the way that different, members of the church respond to him. So the interviews really threw up that fascinating, complexity, inconsistency, perhaps. And then thinking about some of my conservative evangelicals, they also presented feelings of dejection in the interviews. They felt misunderstood, caricatured. One said, followed up by saying, "But that's okay, Jesus was misunderstood." And so there's an identification with the kind of exclusion that Jesus received towards the end of his ministry. And that's quite important, because there is a perception amongst both conservative evangelicals and the traditional Catholics that the Church of England is basically mirroring the way of the world. And the assumption there being that the way of the world is antithetical to Christian faith. And so the boundary between church and society was unhelpfully blurred. And so really, I suppose what they're doing is taking comfort in their sense of marginalization, assuming that their sort of maybe suffering is really an outworking of authentic Christian faith, an authentic following of Jesus, experiencing that marginalization in the way that he did.
That's so fascinating. Sorry to interrupt, Alex, because that completely mirrors the research that I did, where women, although they're in good numbers now in the Church of England, but absolutely do feel that same type of marginality, but for completely different reasons, obviously. So we have this very interesting mirroring of feelings about how positions are received. Can I just ask directly, if I may, did you get a sense that some of that was trying to mask a kind of sexism, if you like, a bias that we might call sexist or even misogynistic, but that was being sort of mapped onto this sort of need to feel that the church is being faithful to its roots and not going with being countercultural, basically? But did you get a sense that some of that was coming from a fairly sexist point of view? Tough question, I know, sorry.
That's okay. I am confident that there was an element of performativity in the interviews. I explore this in detail in one of the chapters in my book, but there is evidence of at least some participants playing to an audience. they were aware that this might end up being published. So that definitely, you know, needs to be accounted for to some extent. They were aware that their views were unfavourable. They would, you know, obviously claim that their views aren't sexist because they don't perceive themselves to have a personal prejudice against women. But what was interesting is thinking about, say, the conservative evangelicals at this point, because I haven't really touched much on that cohort yet. When it came to their interpretation of certain biblical texts, because their approach wasn't really to do with church tradition and, you know, ecumenical relationships and so on. It was to do with the plain meaning reading of scripture. So taking, you know, parts of the Bible without necessarily due regard to their full contextualization. Exposition rather than exegesis is the preferred form of preaching in that tradition. So you go line by line, perhaps in the original language, but you're not doing as fuller historical critical reading as you might otherwise do. And so when it came to how they look at 1 Timothy 2, the text I mentioned earlier, which draws on Genesis 2, where Adam is made before Eve, one of the participants ended up saying that he feels that it's wrong for women to quote, wear the trousers in the marriage. Now, that's quite interesting language, and it was coming from a clear place of frustration when that transcript is looked at in its context, and you see that, you know, the flow of our discussion at this point. He was clearly very frustrated and fed up of the way he'd been perceived to be, or the way he thinks he's perceived to be anyway. And lots of language like that did come out and is evidence of what psychologists call hostile sexism. You know, it's that old school style misogyny that most people, if they kind of stop and hear it, or certainly a lot of people, would recognize that as being a form of sexism. Because this idea of wearing the trousers is obviously a symbol, and symbols are often full of emotion for human beings. That's one of the reasons why symbols can be so powerful in, say, political discourse, that they really capture our emotions. But you had lots of different statements like that across kind of conservative evangelicals and traditional Anglo-Catholics. One participant on the Anglo-Catholic side of things, when I asked him about feminism, started saying, let me get this right. He started explaining what he felt was appropriate about feminism, and then said, you know, however, when feminism, and then kind of broke off, and then said, no, I'm just going to leave it at that. If feminism is purely about you know, equality in places where women have typically been downtrodden, then I'm all for it. And that particular individual as well would come across female priests. One of his friends from training is a woman priest, but they would be very limited in the work they would do with women priests. They wouldn't do anything sacramental, for example. And so, yes, there were telltale signs that they were performing to some extent, and perhaps downplaying any kind of sexism that might be inferred from their answers. But what was quite interesting, during my analysis, I came across this idea called ambivalent sexism by Susan Fisk and Peter Glick, who are social psychologists. And they say that basically sexism, which they define as prejudicial attitudes, so often in social science and critical theory and so on, we often think of sexism or racism and so on in terms of kind of social structures, in terms of how ideas are kind of carried across society, how things can land. But what Glick and Fisk are really interested in is personal motivations and individual attitudes. And so that's the the lens that I end up using. And they say that that sexism is ambivalent, partly because you can be sexist towards women in some contexts, but not necessarily in others, but also because there are two different types. One type is this hostile sexism, you know, that very traditional, old school kind of, you know, negative sentiments, overtly hostile sentiments towards women. The other type of sexism, and bear in mind, this was proposed in the 90s, so gender attitudes were still, you know, they weren't as they were now, obviously. The other type of sexism they called benevolent sexism, but we should really put the word benevolent in inverted commas, as indeed that's how Glick and Fisk use it. I decide, for methodological reasons, to use the word indirect sexism in my book. I think that's probably more appropriate. But it's this idea that you can have attitudes that on the surface of it might seem positive, you know, perhaps, you know, display chivalry and so on and so forth, but actually underlying it are attitudes that ultimately seek to make women out to be in some sense dependent on men, and that can actually undermine conceptions of women's competence. And frequently my conservative evangelicals evidenced both types of sexism, hostile and also indirect or so-called benevolent sexism. Lots of their statements reflected the criteria set out by Glick and Fisk. We probably don't have the time to go into all of that criteria today, but their research is very well documented, very well cited in scholarship, and certainly available, you know, via things like Google Scholar. With the Anglo-Catholics, the benevolent or indirect sexism wasn't as obvious. It wasn't really there very much, if at all, but the hostile sexism was. But what's really interesting about that for me is that heterosexuality is a predictor of indirect or benevolent sexism. And pretty much all of my conservative evangelical participants were heterosexual. They, or at least in heterosexual relationships, same-sex marriages. Opposite-sex marriages. Whereas my Anglo-Catholic participants, half of them indicated to me that they were gay, even if they weren't necessarily practicing their sexuality for theological reasons. And so that could go at least some way in explaining why that kind of benevolent sexism wasn't there. And actually what Glick and Fisk mention is that it is the kind of reliance on heterosexual men on women in kind of romantic companionship and so on that is potentially a shaping factor or a driving force of that kind of sexism. You know, men don't, typically speaking, like to be vulnerable and are obviously socialized in such a way where being vulnerable is very much frowned upon, discouraged, and a threat to one's sense of masculinity and therefore one's sense of self if you are a man. And so it does make sense from that point of view that actually men will react at a subconscious level, by the way. This is all subconscious in the social psychology scholarship. Will respond negatively towards any kind of need for dependence on women. And so by undermining their sense of competence, you know, well, you know, women need men to lead them, that kind of thing. Men are natural leaders, women are comfortable following, those sorts of ideas. Women are much better at the pastoral side of things, but, you know, men have more testosterone and are therefore more able to, you know, make the tough decisions. These sorts of things are likely to stem from what is basically that romantic dependence and that insecurity and vulnerability.
That's absolutely fascinating, Alex, and I'm sure there'll be loads of questions that people have, because that's quite a stark thing to say, actually, that there are these different approaches, but still actually basically sexist attitudes. And it does remind me that complementarianism, of course, is it's a bona fide religious position to have, where you have the two halves, very binary sets of traits, fairly essentialist stuff. And certainly when the argument for women's priesthood was in full swing, the voices that were trying to persuade the church that having women in the priesthood was a good thing actually leveraged those complementarian arguments, saying that the priesthood was only half fulfilled because we need the nurturers and the pastoral people who are women. So that is a fascinating thread there that is still alive, I think, and still being taught and is part of some people's view of human nature, really. I've got a question that's just come in from Susan. Thanks, Susan. So she's asking, presumably the participants chose their training college because of their beliefs. So this obviously goes back to their route into their priesthood. But was age a factor in the strength of their beliefs? And did any participants say their beliefs had changed over time? That's a fascinating question. Thanks, Susan.
Yes, really interesting. So to start with the bit about theological college, and again, I've got a chapter dedicated to this in the book, but so I did what's called a narrative analysis. I basically took participants' lives stage by stage, focusing initially on their call to ordination, through the selection process, through training, and then into diocesan work. Parish-based ministry in whatever diocese they were working in. And what's really interesting is, yes, the most conservative, the most resistant to women's ordination, regardless of whether they're evangelical or Catholic, were in fairly homogenous training environments for the most part, and had tended to come from, again, homogenous churches as well. And so what you have is this kind of enclave structure where it's easy for your beliefs to go unchallenged, for them to seem like a reasonable and correct understanding of either the Bible or of church tradition. It helps maintain what is called a plausibility structure in sociology, a way of looking at the world that seems plausible. And that's very much a social phenomenon rather than a purely intellectual one. And so when they do enter into parish ministry and are having to do professional development and so on, along people from very different backgrounds to them, and when their bishops might have very different theologies to them, there's this very clear withdrawal from the wider church. That's really where a lot of them more consciously, or more overtly, I should say, resist. Well, actually, consciously as well, but resist the wider church structures and so on, and resist engaging with different parts of the church in various ways. And so there is very much a trajectory there, that where they are confronted with difference or diversity, they withdraw. And that's really important for shaping their sexist attitudes where those attitudes exist, because basically it is certain types of sustained contact with people who we deem different to ourselves that prejudicial attitudes become undermined. And so if you are training in a homogenous context, and if you continue to minister in a homogenous context, even if you're coming into some contact with people who are different, but you're not coming into prolonged contact that requires things like collaboration, some sort of mutual dependency and so on, prejudicial attitudes are very unlikely to be undermined or challenged.
And of course, the church is organised in such a way that allows that the not mixing of people if they so choose. Some of those people are separated off, as you say, but the church absolutely enables that, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight to that structural thing, I don't think.
Probably not. No, that seems to be the case. And on the matter of age is an interesting one. The answer is no. There was no real, and I interviewed people from their 30s to their 80s. And what's really interesting is age or generation doesn't seem to be a factor. It's very much about tradition. as in the church tradition they are a part of, evangelical or Catholic, which indicates that for the identity of clergy, it's not so much their generational peers that are as formative for their sense of who they are and what they believe. It is the tradition within the Church of England that they are a part of, although that's not necessarily that surprising, because the Church of England trains people in such a way, it's formation, right? It's theological formation or spiritual formation. And so you would anticipate that the parts of the institution that are training them, which tend to be the traditions that they affiliate with, are having probably the most profound or dominant impact on their sense of who they are, and therefore their beliefs and so on.
Interesting. But it might be also that the cohort that you were interviewing would perhaps people who'd change their mind would self-select themselves out of your cohort. So it might be something that would, other people would want to research. Actually, that sort of I've changed my mind, and this is why sort of conversation.
That's a really interesting point. Yes, I mean, certainly, because we do steer towards people who we deem similar to ourselves. Everyone does it. We're predisposed to do that for evolutionary reasons, to do survival and social cohesion and so on. And so that could well be a factor. Yes, that'd be a very interesting piece of research.
That's our next project, Alex. We ought to get something together about that. Do you mind if I move us on to another question, because folks have started to ask really interesting questions here. So Martine's asking, can you say something about how these men's views tap onto a self-justification theory in trying to hold on to power? How does power sort of come up in your interviews?
Yes. This is directly linked to the nature of their prejudicial beliefs when those beliefs arose. Before I go into that, I just want to caveat that the charismatic evangelical cohort, with only 2 exceptions, didn't hold these complementarian theologies, or they weren't pure gender essentialists. They understood that gender roles could be more dynamic and less binary, and we're happy to have ordained women. But in terms of power, well, it goes back to where prejudicial beliefs really come from. And there's a lot of evidence in the psychological literature that shows that ultimately, as human beings, we are predisposed to, yes, 1, seek out like-minded people, but 2, pursue self-esteem. And those 2 things are really closely related. So I've already said there's an evolutionary reason as to why we seek out like-minded people. It helps with survival, social cohesion, that kind of thing. And related to that, defining ourselves over and against outgroups, people who we perceive to be very different from ourselves, also helps us clarify our group identity, and therefore help with that cohesion, increasing our chance of survival. And so we form our identities in reaction to other people. Now, one of the things that really helps us measure how well we're doing in that is our self-esteem, because our sense of self-worth is basically a measure of the success of our social relationships. That, in essence, is what self-esteem is. There's lots of stuff in popular psychology that talks about self-esteem, and loads of people talk about self-esteem as if what it is self-evident. But actually, if you go to the psychological literature, the kind of academic research, it's a sociometer is what it's referred to as. It's a way of helping us gauge actually how, our sense of worth via our relationships with people. And what normally happens is, in order to boost our sense of self-esteem, which is determined by the status of our group, by the way, the group that we identify with, we end up often hoarding resources. That can be symbolic resources, it can be financial resources, things that essentially boost our social standing or our status in whatever way. That will have all sorts of different contextual manifestations, but that in essence is what happens. And so people who who identify as men are more likely to identify with other men than they are women on average. If you are an evangelical Anglican man and a priest, you're more likely to identify with that group. When in the pursuit of self-esteem, you're going to want that group to have a certain amount of privilege, of social resources. And one way of doing that, a very common way amongst groups that tend to have higher social status, as of course white male clergy do, is basically to exclude other groups, out-groups, from the resources that they're wanting to use in order to boost their status and their self-esteem for their social group. So it's very much a tribal thing that's going on, and none of this is happening at the conscious level. And it's the sort of thing that everyone does to some extent. I mean, you see it in public discourse, I think, a lot of the time, the way that we caricature and try and downgrade different social groups. I think, certainly over the last 6 years has become incredibly apparent, but it's always been there. And it happens beyond religious groups. It happens beyond male groups and white groups and so on. But that is what seems to be happening in this context. And that tends to be the driving force of prejudicial attitudes. Because basically when you try and deny certain groups social resources that would help boost their social standing and pose a threat therefore to your own, and almost inevitability are caricatures and unfavorable beliefs about those outgroups, which is the nature of prejudice. And when it's directed towards women, it's the nature of sexism, of gender-related prejudice.
This is such a fascinating discussion because it's coming at it from a completely different angle to some of the things I've read, for instance. Now, Liz is asking a question that is related to that answer you've just given. It's just, can you say more about how conservative evangelicals, and I guess that's for instance, appear to try to manipulate perception by using certain types of language that obfuscate the prejudice that you're talking about? So things like equal but different, distinctive ministry. So there's this idea of, oh, we're all equal, except these things sort of get separated out. And do you get the impression that language is used for those purposes, or is it more of a kind of generous way of trying to not be sexist?
I mean, they're probably mutually exclusive. I mean, the thing is, if you are a conservative evangelical leader, the chances are you have a larger than average congregation. There's a good chance you're in a more suburban or urban area, and therefore have a slightly more diverse cross-section of society than other churches. Probably not hugely diverse, but a little more diverse. And so you're more likely to come across people in your congregation who might on occasion take issue with some of those beliefs, or at least have people who struggle in your congregation who will struggle to articulate that belief beyond the church community. And so what do? Well, you model a softer language, equal but different. And yeah, I think that does obfuscate. I think it does kind of cushion some of the more sexist language. Equal but different definitely came up. Things like, it's a loud yes to what women can do, or a big yes to what women can do, and just a very small no as a way of kind of trying to contextualize what they're saying. That was also present. But I think the softer language as well is about evangelicalism as a tradition. So Christian Smith has this great book called American Evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving. And a lot of his findings, although actually not all of them, and I argue against some of them for the UK context in my book, But some of his findings are really relevant to the context of the evangelicalism in the Church of England. And what he says is one of the reasons evangelicalism has tended to resist decline, or at least declined at a slower rate than other traditions in the Church of England, is because it is engaged with wider society in such a way where it selectively incorporates elements of wider societal culture, whilst ultimately trying to push back against a lot of it. And so inevitably you will have a softening of language as it engages with a culture that is less traditionalist than it once was. I mean, you have, feminist evangelical hermeneutics, for example. The evangelical tradition is not as monochrome on the question of gender roles as it once was. And so how do you deal with that if you're a more traditional evangelical? You've got fellow evangelicals with quite different views. And so I think really that's probably where a lot of that softening comes from. But yes, that sort of language of equal but different is definitely there. Except for when you talk about feminism, and that's where a lot of the more sexist language became much more apparent. One participant from the conservative evangelical group saying, I don't have a lot of time for this, we're under the cosh of patriarchy, quote unquote, thinking that it was just nonsense. Other participants across the cohorts talking about feminism as being shrill and demonizing men. So even though they've got relatively privileged status, going back to what we were saying earlier, they still feel this sense of marginalization, and there's a strong reaction against that. And that feeds into, and I guess that's partly what that last question was about, the desire to want to have some sort of power or status. And they're reacting against the perception of that status being diminished.
Okay, just to take us to a more sort of practical and obvious question in a way from Ewan, particularly with Anglo-Catholics, did you ask, or did you get an answer to why they were still in the Church of England and why hadn't they joined the Ordinariate, the group of priests that went to join the Catholic Church, particularly in light of, we really want to see more unification with the world church, and the Catholic Church is where the authority is. Did you get a sense of why then they weren't going to the church, the Catholic Church?
That's a really interesting question as well. Well, there's probably multiple answers to this. Some of them pointed towards this booklet that had been written back in the 90s, when this was a really live debate in the Church of England. And they came to the view that the Ordinariate, so the bit of the Catholic Church that was reserved for Anglo-Catholics, wasn't an adequate kind of structure for Anglo-Catholics to be in. I'd have to go over that booklet to really remind myself of the finer details of the arguments. But of course, there were many priests who did go over to the Catholic Church, many of which later came back. Now, as a researcher, you've got to be very careful about what questions you ask and don't ask.
Yeah.
There's this delicate balance between getting as much information as you possibly can, but also not wanting to make participants feel on the back foot, or like, they're under the Spanish Inquisition, because they already, as I've already said, feel like they're on the back foot, they feel marginalized. And I don't want them to shut off from giving really interesting answers, but also in terms of research ethics, I've got a responsibility not to make them feel like their back's against the wall. And so there's always this delicate tightrope. And some of the more direct questions that I may have chosen to ask, I sometimes decided not to. So I didn't get direct answers to that question. But something else that is interesting is that a number of my Anglo-Catholic participants had partners, civil partners, so same-sex partners, sometimes civil partners, which I don't believe would be allowed in the Catholic Church, even in the Ordinariate. So I would suspect that that may also have been a factor. Like I say, I think there's probably no one factor, but also when it comes to schism, which is really what you're talking about, and again, there's a chapter on schism in my book. One of the things that is required for schism is the perception of a lack of voice. Well, there's definitely evidence that they believe their voice is declining in the church. And so maybe 10 years from now, more people will leave the Church of England for the Catholic Church, or, you know, to form independent evangelical churches and so on. But they still have, through their structures, like Forward in Faith, which has been amalgamated into something called the Society, you know, through these structures, they still do have a voice. They can have their own bishops if they want to, rather than having to have bishops who will ordain women or will support women's ministry. And so as long as that sense of voice remains sufficient, I don't think we're going to see an exodus of male clergy. I mean, at the end of the day, the Church of England seeks to try and be democratic and to try and give voices to all groups. And so I think that those participants staying in the Church of England, it's probably an outworking of that sense of voice, even if they feel it is diminishing. Okay, and that links to a question that Sophie's asking about the structure then of the Church of England, which the church hierarchy is making an attempt to allow people with those views where women shouldn't be or can't be women priests, where they have a place in the church where they can flourish and feel comfortable and valued and supported. And so we have this, I don't know whether it's still used, but the colloquial term is flying bishops that would have oversight over those parishes that chose to come out of the normal structure of the church. So Sophie's question is, does that actually normalise some of these views that people outside the church might sort of be fairly uncomfortable with, or does it in fact do the opposite, and does it highlight the kind of non-normal or the extraordinary views that are held about women priests? What sense did you get from your interviews? Fascinating. I think it partly depends on how high your view is of episcopacy. Now, for Anglo-Catholics, episcopacy is key, and actually again, I go into this in much more detail in the book, but the trajectory that the traditional Catholics are on started because of a perception that the British government was wanting to take away an element of power, basically, from bishops by reducing the number of bishops you had in the Irish See. Not literally the Irish See, SEA, CSEE. Thanks for pointing that out, actually. Just to clarify, you know, bishops, Church of England bishops or Anglican bishops in Ireland in the 19th century. So the role of bishop is really key. And so I suppose if you're more inclined to view things, you know, to a more kind of Catholic ecclesiology, I think it probably does somewhat normalise those views. It certainly helps provide a kind of siloed or enclaved structure for those priests to continue to minister in. And I suppose if you are a tradition that is good at kind of raising up people to then become leaders in the church, you might find that then kind of compounds some of the issues that we've been talking about. If you're a conservative evangelical, you probably have a lower view of episcopacy, of the ministry of bishops. You certainly have a less Catholic view. I mean, some participants, for example, were conservative evangelicals, were tempted to join the Free Church of England, which split off from the Church of England in the 19th century and doesn't really have that hierarchy in the same way. I think they are less hierarchical, and so does having a flying bishop actually highlight how unusual their beliefs are in that context? So possibly. I mean, I suppose those answers aren't mutually exclusive. The social world is full of paradoxes and contradictions, and part of the reason is because we as human beings, as social beings, aren't entirely rational. We have great capacity for rationality, but in our day-to-day lives, we tend not to exhibit it. We tend to be much more intuitive or instinctive in how we approach things. And so you can get mixed messages and have mixed attitudes towards things. I mean, ambivalent psychology is a whole kind of subfield within modern psychology. So yeah, I'd say they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but I think it's probably more normalizing in the traditional Catholic side of things, I would think, especially because liberal Catholics and Anglo-Catholics tend not to collaborate that much. They're quite divided theologically, whereas evangelicals, there's more interaction between different strands of evangelicalism. And so you are perhaps in some respects less siloed when you've got, you know, other evangelical leaders who you might look to for some things, who have a slightly different position on women's leadership, which could highlight the unusualness of your own view if you're more conservative on the matter.
Thanks, Alex. Now we've ripped up our script, obviously, because there's a lot of questions, and we've only got a few minutes left. So one question that is quite current at the moment, certainly if you're on Anglican Twitter and you're a follower of that conversation, is the question about transparency of these views, which is incredibly important. If you don't know what views are being supported in your local church, you know, how do you know whether you're, as a woman, going to be encouraged in leadership, for example? So we have a question from somebody here who wants to know if you covered that in the interviews, or what sense of not being transparent about views that you got from the conversations.
Yes, I would say that they are more or less transparent. So slight caveat would be that it's not something they particularly would preach on. They wouldn't set out to preach on their gender views. What they would say in the conservative evangelical tradition, they would normally just preach through one book of the Bible at a time in that exposition way. So if it came up, and then they'll be clear on what they thought. They might do a sort of extracurricular, you know, outside of Sunday school, outside of Sunday services type thing, if there was a debate going on in General Synod, but people could opt into, but you obviously have far fewer people going to there than they do to a Sunday service. Anglo-Catholics tend to follow the lectionary more, so whatever comes up in the Bible readings for that Sunday comes up. Excuse me. Now, one participant from that tradition did say during midweek communion, there was, I think it was a passage from 1 or 2 Peter that talks about the woman as the weaker vessel, or at least in traditional translations it does. So he decided, actually, just going to turn over the page and read a slightly different reading, because he was aware there was a woman in his congregation who would find that quite difficult. So there's a lack of transparency there, although interestingly, it seems the motivation wasn't to be disingenuous. It was actually perhaps about avoiding conflict, or maybe about a pastoral sensitivity. There's more than one way of reading that. So yeah, transparency is, it's not completely one or the other, but also participants did say to me, you know, I'm glad this is anonymous, because they wouldn't normally say this in a pulpit. So that there was an element of they went beyond, and that's where a lot of the kind of hostily sexist comments came out. That was the sort of thing they wouldn't normally say from the pulpit. They might say the more benevolently sexist stuff more publicly.
That is absolutely fascinating, and do let us know when your book hits the shelves, and we'll all, I'm sure, rush out and buy a copy. I'm so sorry, folks, we have run out of time, and there were still more questions. So obviously you've hit a nerve here, Alex, with your research, and given us that insight into a cohort that probably, well, certainly I would never really get a chance to sit down with and talk about. Loads of questions that remain outstanding. So maybe we'll get you back and we'll do something with your book launch. I don't know, we'll have a think about that. Thanks everybody for coming along and supporting this event. Again, do go to our blog site, Centre for Religion in Society at York St John University, and we really hope that you'll attend other events. They're free and anybody's welcome. So thanks again, folks, and thanks Alex for spending time with us.
Thanks so much, and thank you for your questions.